From the beginning of Montana's distinctive yet troubled history, the Treasure State was dominated, both economically and politically, by powerful outside interests who shipped in capital and bought control of the state. Historians tell us that as the Anaconda Company and its friends ran Montana, economic and political power flowed out into the hands of distant capitalists and corporations. Policy was determined in far-off New York City, and control of the press was rigid. Anaconda's corporate dominance in Montana's political affairs was unique in American history. For its first 75 years, Montana was a one-company state. But then big winds of change roared across the Treasure State. Between 1965 and 1980, Montanans ripped off their copper collar, transforming Montana from a corporate colony into a free, modern state. The people finally controlled their own destiny. The pitched battle between the people and the established power structure was not easily won, but fired in a crucible of change. A new Montana was born. Join Evan Barrett and real history makers of the time as they shine a light on this remarkable era.
Welcome back to In the Crucible of Change. Today we're going to have a program which we've entitled New Kids on the Block. And it's really about young people entering public service and what they've been able to accomplish or were able to accomplish and what it meant to them and to the public as they moved forward in their careers. And we do have an interesting and a group of people that I ran into way back in the 1969 to 71 period who came to work as young folks in Forrest Anderson's office, and have since that time, all three of them had very distinguished careers in public service. But the emergence of young people at that time was a hallmark of the period of the Crucible of Change. And there may be questions why. Perhaps it was just the emergence of the baby boomers, most of whom were born right after World War II. It could well be that it was the election of a Democratic administration in Helena, Montana after 16 years of Republican rule and the opportunities presented with that. It could just be the times, the Vietnam era, the 1960s, but for whatever reason, there was an explosion of young people entering public service, and our three guests today entered public service at its highest level in Montana as assistants to Governor Forrest Anderson in those first few years of the Crucible of Change. So I'm very happy that we have at the table with us some good friends of mine over many years, but I would like to mention first the senior member of the administration was Frank Sennett. Frank is from Lewistown, and after graduating from the University of Montana, ended up working for the Montana State Senate during the 1969 session. And while he was doing that, he was communicating well with the governor's office, including Executive Assistant Ron Richards, who at the end of the session gave Frank a shot to try to do some work and see if you could really perform, and apparently you must have, because a month later you got hired as one of the first administrative assistants that Forrest Anderson had.
That's right.
And Frank continued on and focused predominantly in the human services area, but like everyone else who did this kind of work, we all answered letters, we answered constituent calls, we did whatever was necessary, but you were focused in the human services area.
Right.
Later, you left to become the Deputy Director of the Department of Social and Rehabilitative Services.
Yes.
Frankly, over this period of years, including the time when you went back home to Lewistown, you've been in the human service sector, working in the nonprofit sector and the governmental sector, providing human services in central Montana. A distinguished career. And now distinguished retirement. Welcome to it.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have Frank here. Frank was the first one in the door of these three, and Frank had become acquainted at the University of Montana with our next guest, which is Gary Wicks. Gary was at the University of Montana at the same time Frank was, same time I was in graduate school, and Gary was the one of us who had served in the military. You'd been in the Vietnam era military, and got your degrees in political science and history at UM. Knew Frank there. At the time Frank started in at the governor's office, you were looking for work as well, and your acquaintance with him opened the door for discussions with Ron Richards, again, a familiar name we all have, one of our mentors of all of us, who looked at you. You'd been pursuing an MBA, by the way. I think you got that MBA, didn't you?
No.
Okay. Anyway, in August of '69, Frank came on just a little bit earlier than that, in April of '69, and in August of '69, you came on board Governor Anderson's staff and you were able to focus predominantly in the natural resource area, although again, we all had to be multifaceted.
Natural resources, budget, sales tax. Yeah.
Sales, yeah. And Gary's distinguished career continued on with Governor Judge. Then you went to the federal government for a significant number of years with the Department of Interior, came back to the West, and then ultimately back to Montana, where you were 8 years as the head of the Transportation Department under Governor Schwinden.
Right.
You've had an amazing career in public service, and it was fun to work together all in those years way back
absolutely,
when.
Absolutely.
I'm glad you're able to be here. And the youngest, or the freshest of the three is Mike Fitzgerald. Mike, unlike the UM boys here, came out of Carroll College, and he had
outlier.
You know, he had gotten some recommendations that opened the door that came from a graduate of my alma mater. You know, I graduated from St. John's University in Minnesota, and Governor Dick Knipe of South Dakota graduated from there. And apparently he put a bee in the ear of Governor Anderson and said, "Why don't you take a look at this guy?" It was a family connection. And after an interview, you were hired, and you were right at it, starting actually in September of '71.
Right.
So you came almost at the time Frank was ready to leave, but you were I always looked at you three guys as the fellows that epitomized what it meant to be young, energetic, and have an opportunity to serve in the governor's office of the state of Montana. Wow, what an opportunity.
It was a big honor.
And, you know, we all knew each other then. We all learned from each other, and we learned from mentors that we shared. In fact, in your time, Mike, you worked on institutions, you worked on community affairs, you worked on labor, you did a lot of business, and eventually the fledgling efforts of economic development.
Right.
And you and I have become economic development players over the years, ultimately, but it was just formative at that time.
It was. No states were doing really any economic development, and we were inventing it out of thin air, really.
So you worked
no
with Governor Anderson, Governor Judge,
yes.
Ultimately ended up with the Montana Trade Commission. A lot of your work with multi-state organizations,
right?
With the other states. And then ultimately you've had a long career in Washington State, in Florida, and Hawaii, and now in Denver in economic development.
Correct.
So you guys have brought a lot to the table here. You've been very, very successful. It's always such a pleasure for us to get, but we just had a great lunch, and it was great to be able to recall a lot of things and tell some stories that we've now agreed will not be told on the air. Okay,
Correct.
But we'll tell the salient public sector stuff here.
Highlights.
And get on it, because it is an interesting thing to get this opportunity. And I guess first and foremost, I'd ask each one of you, starting with Frank, what your thoughts were walking in the door when you were the youngest administrative assistant in the nation for a governor at the time.
Yes. To me, it was one of the most exciting times of my life. I had dropped out of graduate school at the university and wanted to go to work, and in the middle of the winter there wasn't a lot of work, and I had a father-in-law who knew State Senator John McEwen, and he talked with Walter Marshall, and I ended up being Assistant Secretary to the Senate, only because I was there. I went there, and I went every day and sat around outside of Walter's office and let him know that I was ready to go to work whenever he wanted me. And basically I bugged Ron Richards that way after I found out who he was and and what he did in government, because at that point in my life, having graduated in history, I was extremely inspired by John F. Kennedy and his words to come out and do service for the country. And that was how I came into state government. Very naive, very young, very green. But it was, like I say, probably the most exciting thing I've ever done in my life since even, in the sense of just, it was such a heady time. And I was there all kinds of hours and weekends, and it was all worth it. It was all so exciting and so stimulating. And we accomplished so much. Gary and I were talking earlier, we accomplished a lot because we were naive. We didn't think that about not being able to do it. It was like, yeah, we can do this. What do you want us to do?
Yeah.
We're ready.
You know, it's amazing if you carry that forward. I carried that forward into economic development because I would do things that people say, well, why did you do that? No one ever did that before. I said, I didn't know it couldn't be done. I mean, it just, you just go at it and you give it a go, and that kind of thing will carry you not just through your first years, but the view, the perspective of when you're sitting in a governor's office and you've got all this government and trying to make it function for people. That perspective is unique. It is unique, and it really sets you up for your lifetime, I think, in a way. Gary, you came in, and now remember, we're talking Forrest Anderson here. We're talking about Forrest Anderson bringing the younger generation into government at the time, and he was a crafty, codgy, savvy guy that we're going to talk a lot about him. But what when you got started here, how did you feel about it, and how did it get going?
I was glad as hell to get a job to start out with, but you know, I guess I never knew what I was in for. But once I got in and started to be tutored under Ron Richards and got to know Forrest a little better, it became obvious that this was a hell of a thing to be doing, and I learned so much from there that carried me on to different offices I've had in the public sector for the last 25 or 30 years. And I mean, it was just an experience that ends up defining your life, your public life. And so I just look back on it like Frank with fondness of a time that we could do anything, and our naivete actually helped us, because a lot of people that had been a lot of political experience, been around Montana a lot, would have come in there and just said, no, this is impossible. And
put in their time or be
put in their
jaded
time,
about it.
Yeah, exactly. And there's enthusiasm, I think, that's you cannot discount in terms of you know, it helps to be young, it helps to be energetic, it helps to be committed to try to make government work better, and all those things were part of the Forrest Anderson office.
You know, you reminded me over lunch that, you know, we first got to know each other way over at UM in the anti-war effort that was going on. I was working for McCarthy. I was with the McCarthy for President effort over there as a graduate student. You were there at the same meetings and stuff, and because I think that if there had been maybe a different administration, you know, folks like us wouldn't have found a home.
Oh yeah, that's I think the important thing for me, and I think for everybody else around the table here, is that when we were interviewed for the job by Ron Richards, he was the guy that ended up hiring us. I'm sure Forrest obviously gave his okay, but Ron was the guy who interviewed us and made the decision that they ought to go forward. But there was never any discussion of politics. I don't think Ron Richards knew that I was a Democrat, Republican, and I wasn't anything at that point in time in terms of political affiliation. And they hired us still. They hired us because of, I think, the things that Frank talked about, the energy, the enthusiasm coming out of school, the willingness to work hard and try and make government a better place. Yeah.
And you branched out upward in a sense to the federal government, but I in all the work I've done over many, many years, I look at the governorship as being kind of a unique institution.
Yes.
That is that you don't. It's hard. You get that experience, and it's unmatched.
Yes, I think that's right, and I think that, you know, if you look at some of the best presidents of the United States have been previous governors. Teddy Roosevelt, FDR, a lot of them have been governors, and I think that's a great training ground for governors and young people that go along with him, as long as you have a governor who is committed to actually running government and making a difference in how people live. And Forrest clearly was that. And just about, I think that's a shared commitment we all had. I mean, I don't think there's anybody that I ever remember working with in those years that wasn't dedicated to try and make government and the state of Montana a better place.
sure.
You know, we're going to talk about that as a contrast to today a little bit later, because there's often much about the way things function today that is contrary to that.
Right.
I'm not sure we lived in a golden age, but there was a difference, and we're going to discuss that. But Mike, when you came out of Carroll College, you weren't idealistic or anything, were you? Or you weren't naive, were you?
All of that and just off the boat, just off the boat, Evan. But full of energy and enthusiasm, and like these guys, you know, that was part of the time that we were born and came of age, was this terrific movement throughout the United States. And to be in Montana, I think that was the best of all possible worlds. And to get these positions that we three got and have the opportunities that we had with very little coaching, but always people standing behind us. Ron Richards screened us all before we actually got access to the system. But then we had lots of running room. And basically he said, go out and figure out how to do this. And we were doing lots of stuff there was no blueprint for because it hadn't been done before. So literally we were inventing it, trying. Some things didn't work, others did, but we just kept going. It was a glorious time.
And part of it was you were active in a period of an energized activist state government following
Absolutely.
years and maybe decades of lethargy. That, in fact, a lethargy that, in a confusion prior to reorganization, an ineffective government that actually, in its ineffectiveness, served the powerful interests of the state. Part of the premise of this program that we're doing, this whole series we're doing, is that the copper collar that was around Montana, including everything up to including the newspapers all the way to 1959, owned by the Anaconda Company. The copper collar that was served the Anaconda Company, Montana Power, you know, Burlington Northern, Plum Creek Lover, the Farm Bureau, the stock growers. Those were the powerful economic interests of the state, and it was in their interest to have an ineffective legislature, to have an ineffective executive branch. That allowed them to maintain their economic control. So suddenly we're in a period of active and energized government where Forrest Anderson led a kind of a revolution of government to make it effective. He walked in the door so prepared to be governor, but he really wanted to govern. He didn't want to sit there and do nothing, so he wanted to make stuff happen. Now, I think when he came in the door, I think you told me he had only a couple basic rules. Pretty much was go get it done, don't screw up, don't get me in trouble, and do whatever it takes.
Yeah,
but,
right. And just if you need anything, check with me. And that was it. Go for it.
Now,
we each had a
that,
list of what areas we were covering, and go for it.
Part of that seems to point to the fact that Forrest Anderson seemed to have had his eye on the ball.
Yep.
He didn't get tied up in all the excruciating details.
Gary's right. He had a very defined
He knew what he
agenda.
wanted to do. Is that right?
He had his priorities, had 4 or 5 priorities that he wanted to get done, and he didn't move off those at all. And he got them done. He got them all done. I mean, it was a caretaker government before that. That's how I describe it.
Yeah, I think that's a good word.
The government before Forrest took over, and it was a very involved, energetic government after he got there and after he got all the things that he wanted to get done. I think the other thing Forrest said in terms of when you went to work for him was that I carried on through all my administrative management career, and that is no surprises. You don't have to tell me everything, I just don't want to be surprised by anything, and that's something that I always tried to have people who worked for me do the same thing, and I tried to do it and did do it for Forrest. Yeah.
It's a good policy because you can smell it coming, and if you attempt to avoid it, it's going to come around and bite you anyway.
Right.
What was different with Forrest, and we all went on to work for other people, but nobody like him, is he didn't want surprises, but he didn't want you to translate that as don't do bold things.
Oh yeah, that's
Don't
correct.
try things. Push, but I don't want to read it. I want to know about it before the newspapers come.
Yeah, I think you always knew with Forrest, or at least I did, and I know Frank did too, is that but that meant that you could go in and talk to him, or Ron for sure, and say, this is a thing I'm thinking of doing, and if he thought it needed to be done, he'd let you go off and do it. I mean, he didn't stop you. He'd encourage you to come up with things to try and make government work better. And
That was it right there.
right, and then you could go off and do it, and just keep him informed. And he just turned you loose. I mean, if you'd done off some crazy things, I'm sure you wouldn't have been there very long, because
Right.
Forrest, he wouldn't tolerate very much of a violation of those kind of pretty basic ground rules. He wouldn't be there very long, and everybody knew that. But he was a good guy to work for. He understood, and
Yeah.
he let you go.
Having your eye on the ball and having those 4 or 5 major items, with the experience he came into government and wanted it to be effective, probably the first big item he had in his mind was executive reorganization. And that's where, Frank, you and I got together, because
Right.
you were the administrative assistant in the governor's office who was assigned to be coordinated with the Reorganization Commission where I worked.
Exactly.
And
You
we
and-
traveled
you
a
and I-
lot of the state together.
You and I visited a lot.
Yeah. We went around the state and gave talks about why we should reorganize. And no one wants to be reorganized.
No.
What is the rule? That reorganization is really good, except not
Not
for
us.
us.
We're special.
Not us.
We're
Yeah.
special. Right?
Yeah.
Tell us about your sense of that whole thing of getting the reorganization done. And
To me, it was the most important thing that happened in state government under Forrest Anderson. There were a lot of other very important things, but I mean, that was the one that he brought to the table right off the bat, and that was the one that I felt like he had the most success at, was getting that reorganization done. We had 160 some boards, bureaus, and agencies, and we wound up with 19. And that way the cabinet was manageable. People could be held accountable. And it was cost effective. People weren't doing the same thing in parallel because they didn't know who one another were. Now they were all in the same agency together, and they were working together. So very, very positive, and I think it's changed the face of government in Montana ever since.
no question that it has changed the face of it. In fact, I think that if you look at the outline of government in Montana, at the conclusion of executive reorganization with Forrest, that 90% of that structure is still in place.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
it's
mean, it has
lasting.
stood the test of time. Very interestingly, now you actually then got to experience the implementation of it in a department, because
Gary and I both did.
both of you did, and you got it with SRS, which had to be a very complicated social and rehabilitative services, which was a gathering of most of the human service functions.
Right,
of
other
government.
than the health department.
And you went over and became a deputy director over there.
Yep, and helped get everything off the ground. Like you say, we started from scratch, and we had to find buildings to be in. We had to deal with leases that needed to be broken or changed in some manner, and we had to get people together, and we had to get people starting to communicate with one another. And everybody had their own agenda, so it was an effort to bring everybody together and to make that work. But it was an effort that was well worth the while. I saw a lot of very positive changes in human services in the time that I was at SRS, and a lot of that was because of the collaboration and the cooperation.
Now, executive reorganization, which was masterfully put together politically by Forrest, we'll talk about that in a second, actually ended up happening by passage of, I believe it was Senate Bill 274 in the 1971 legislature. And at the end of that session, come July 1st is the time to start rolling the implementation in. So here we are late in 71. A year later, Forrest Anderson is not running for re-election. So he didn't get to experience the benefits of the consolidated, restructured government so much as those that succeeded him.
True.
But you went over to SRS and got it kind of going. Later on in the 70s, the issue of deinstitutionalization of the kind of services for the mentally ill and the developmentally disabled and the children in the orphanages of the state, and those kind of. It really happened big time in the mid-'70s, but it started.
It started under
when
Forrest
you,
Anderson's
when you were there working with Forrest. Tell us about
administration.
that.
Well, it was, again, I think it's part of what we were talking about earlier, is that there was a huge momentum nationally for change to happen and for people to look at new ways to do things. And that certainly influenced all of us, I think, coming young and green out of school and having a lot of idealism. It was very exciting again. I mean, to me, to pull all of those things together and to make them work together was one of the big accomplishments that I felt like I'd made in my life. One that affected things on down the road into the future. And that's not to negate other things I've done, because I ended up becoming a teacher and I ended up touching a lot of people's lives individually as opposed to globally. And I made that change on purpose. I had done what as far as time went and as far as energy went, what I wanted to do with larger groups by the time I went back to school and got a teaching certificate. And my goal at that point was to influence and affect individuals and individual lives. But those first few years with Anderson affected people's lives for generations to come. And it affected the entire state of Montana. So very heady experience.
To this day, yeah, without question. Now, in the natural resource field, there was a lot of very dramatic things going on in the state at the time because of the concept that we were going to be a sacrifice zone to new energy development, though although it didn't develop to the degree it did, it set a stage for really getting after things and doing things differently. One of those things in your sector was with working with Forrest Anderson was the water laws of Montana. If we were going to have our water sucked up in slurry pipelines that were going to take it all out of state, moving coal through pipelines and leave no jobs in Montana and take all the water in the process, did we have tools to stop that? And the answer was pretty much
no.
Maybe no, huh?
Yeah. No, and so, Department of Natural Resources, like you said, I think the other thing about reorganization, it was put into effect pretty rapidly. So
yeah.
When the bill became law in July of 1971, I became director of Montana Department of Natural Resources in December of 1971, and so
you were the youngest department director amongst all of them.
At that point.
Hard to think of it in those terms.
Yes,
but it's
it is.
true.
Yeah, 50 years later, what the hell? Yeah. So, but and so there at that point in time, I think you can't escape what else was going on in the rest of the country, and it was clearly in the direction of trying to get some control over the natural resources in Montana, control over the environment. Some of the things, the Silent Spring book, it was a lot of people were energized by that.
The first Earth Day was
First Earth Day, exactly right. Yeah, and
there was an awareness.
It was an
and it was
awareness.
shared by political parties, by the way.
That's exactly right.
This thing about denial of things like climate change, denial of science, not participating in environmental things, which exists today in the modern Republican Party. That wasn't the way it was.
There was some of the
didn't exist.
Yeah,
Nixon supported the environmental movement.
He created it.
NEPA. Yeah,
NEPA.
he did NEPA.
NEPA, and EPA too.
Yeah, so what the reference
The water
to the water reclamation, or the Bureau of Reclamation, they came out with a big study in the 1970, estimating that the development, coal gasification and coal power development in eastern Montana was going to be massive. And that scared a lot of people, including a lot of ranchers in eastern Montana who wanted to continue to ranch. And so that was part of the background of the need to do something about Montana's water law, because before 1973, before the law got passed, there was no administrative procedure for water rights in Montana. If you wanted to use water, you just went out and started using it unless somebody challenged it. There was no permit required, no analysis of what the impact would be on other water users. And so it was a very, we were behind every other state in terms of how we administered water. And Forrest understood that, allowed me to go ahead and try and change it, and gave me a lot of advice on how to structure that. And one of the reasons we ultimately were successful is just what you mentioned. A lot of the people that we brought into the process were Republican senators and legislators who had the same shared concern about Montana that all the rest of us did in the face of all this massive development and the supposed building of Allentown Dam on the Yellowstone River. I mean, all those things were being laid out, and everybody, Republican or Democrat, was concerned about that if we went forward with that kind of stuff, we need to have some controls over it that would make sure the people of Montana benefited from that kind of development. And so the water use, because obviously that was central to every single thing that happened with coal development and power development, and that became a really central place where we had to do something, or else we were not going to be able to do what I think the people of Montana wanted to get done. And so that was a very difficult process to get that law passed through the legislature, and it wouldn't have got done without senators like Bill Birchie and Bill Groff and Bill Lowe from Republican from Billings, and a whole bunch of other people that I can't remember the names of, who got involved and were concerned and helped us get that legislation passed. And so it went through the 1973. It was all, we had hearings starting in 72, and got the bill ready after a lot of changes and stuff, and introduced it in 73. And Tom Judge and Bill Christensen both supported, the lieutenant governor, both supported the bill, and it went through the legislature, passed the House, I think, by one vote, and we got it through. And that set the framework for a whole bunch of other stuff that it was necessary to have that administrative framework in place before we could do the Yellowstone moratorium, before we could do the compacts with the tribes and the federal government, the most recent one with the Flathead tribe. And so that bill was critical to what was going to happen to the future of Montana.
Makes me think of two things. One is that we always kind of laugh with that phrase that in the West or in Montana that whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting, but
Yeah.
it kind of was.
Absolutely.
And unless you had Marquis of Queensberry rules, so to speak, to govern the fight, you know, who's going to win but the toughest, meanest man in town? And so the rules were what this was all about. The other thing that strikes me is that it was another example of something that Forrest started, but because he did it all in one term and then left, it was passed in the next legislative session, supported by Governor Judge, and the benefits of it accrued to future generations.
Right.
What he was doing.
Yep.
I think we see so much of what he did
His leadership
didn't benefit him
No.
as a governor, it benefited the future.
He just knew it needed to be done and understood that, and supported it. And you know, he was the kind of guy that for all of us in terms of a mentor, he gave me some ideas about management and dealing with people and politics and all that carried forward for the rest of my career in government, and I never lost it.
You know, we just suck it up like sponges.
When you're young.
When we're like that.
Yeah.
When we're empty vessels, so to
Right.
speak, and we're just ready for the right input.
Yeah.
And
Opportunity.
Yeah, and I want to come back in a second and ask about our mentor, Ron Richards, but I want maybe, Mike, if you could reflect, because when you came in, what Governor Anderson was one of the things he did, and he kind of slid it under the door of executive reorganization, was to reorganize and create the Board of Investments and take this free flow of money to all the banks. And I mean, there was so much back scratching and log rolling going on with the bankers and where the money was kept, and the citizens were being robbed of the interest rate for the monies while the banks had the monies. This was a great big thing. There had to be very powerful interests that didn't want to have that happen. And I think in your position, all of a sudden, you were made aware of that kind of thing and how he dealt with that, because big folks were not looking for the change Forrest was looking for.
No, and it's a place, where the powers that be are powers that be because they've mastered the system that is, and this system they were seeing was about ready to be changed, and dramatically. There was a constant stream of business people, bankers, contractors, lawyers into Forrest's office for the entire time that I was there. and these guys had maybe just gone, but they saw this too, because these people were desperate not to have these changes made because they were benefiting so overwhelmingly from the situation the way it was. And Forrest was right at the epicenter of that. Had he not been strong, had he not had the vision, had he not cared as deeply about this state and its future as he did, he wouldn't have had to do anything, and these things wouldn't have happened. He wouldn't have had to take any action. He just could have let the overwhelming powers that be get away with it again. He just sat down with these people, and I think he always had one of us in his office when he was meeting with these people. Most of them would come more than one. And he would basically just say to them, gentlemen, and it was almost always men, you better get ready because change is here, period. Now they didn't like that, and they would bob and weave, yes, but Forrest, and yes, but Forrest, and how about this? But he was firm, and by the time they left his office, there was no doubt that he was not going to change his mind about this. He was pushing. He had a vision of the future of Montana. He understood, as Gary just said, what those tools were going to need to be done to empower Montanans to invent whatever future they needed to do in coming months and coming years that were not predictable at that point. And he stood firm on that. That was an amazing observance and lesson in political fortitude, political will, but realizing this guy was the master of the political game. He'd held every single office already in this state. He was committed to this state and the people in the future, and he stuck firm on all of this.
He was, Forrest, as everybody knows, and he gets a lot of credit for, rightfully so, being a shrewd politician, and he was that. But he also was a guy that would do stuff that did not make, if he thought it was the right thing to do, did not have to necessarily make sense politically. And
he didn't go with the winds.
Yeah, no, he didn't. The wind was not of much interest to him. He just was a force. Yeah.
Let me ask you guys to reflect on what I consider one of our great mentors, certainly was in my life, Ron Richards. And by the way, we did do a special program in the Crucible of Change about Ron. We call it Consigliere because he was so important to Lee Metcalf and Forrest Anderson and Tom Judge. But if he was important to them, boy, was he important to people like us who walked in the door, empty vessels ready to be filled with wisdom. Talk a little bit about Ron.
Oh, like I say, I bugged the man, and he didn't throw me out, and he was very patient, because I probably was down in his office visiting with him once a week during the session, because I really wanted a job. Like Gary, I was looking at, it would be really nice to have a permanent position somewhere, and he was always very encouraging, very kind, very patient. I almost never remember him getting very upset with me about any dumb thing I did.
He was a level-headed guy, if there ever was one. Kept his cool.
And I had taken a lot of writing classes in college, and discovered under Ron's tutorship that I really didn't know how to write. And
we need to remind folks that Ron was a journalism professor at UM before he came over here,
right,
or before he went to Washington D.C. Yeah.
Terse and telegraphic were two words that he burned into my mind when it came to writing, and that stayed with me all my life. I tend to be very wordy when I write, and so I have to go back and edit everything that I write. And I think Ron's looking over my shoulder at that point. Terse and telegraphic, you want to get it out there, you want to get the attention, but you don't want to bore people. And so he really taught me that. Probably was one of the more important things that I learned from him, but it's just general kindness was always there. And if I thought I was in trouble, I could go in and talk with him and figure out a way out of the trouble and find a solution to whatever I was dealing with. And sometimes he'd tell me I need to go back and think about it some more. He was very much about empowering me and the other people that he worked with to stand on our own 2 feet, to use our brains, and like I say, he was just one of the most important mentors in my life.
Well, he didn't, there was no fear imposed upon you or put upon you. It was more about freedom than fear. And it seemed to me, and teamwork, that you were on a team, and the team wasn't going to abandon you if you did your job on the team.
Right.
So let's go out and do this.
Yep.
That's kind of how I sensed it. But Gary, what is your reflections on
Well,
that?
first of all, I think, you know, if Forrest was rightfully the captain of the ship, Ron was the navigator, the engineer, the purser, the communications officer that got the ship into the port where Forrest wanted it to go. And he was a guy that was smart, one of the smartest guys I ever met. And, you know, outside of this table, I've met some other smart guys. And
Hard to believe.
Yeah, hard to believe. Yeah, the level, the bar's pretty high right around the table. But Ron was. I don't know. I mean, for a guy's first real serious job, you know, after the military and stuff like that, to be able to work with Ron Richards, and you never saw Forrest, rarely. I mean, Ron was the day-to-day guy in that office, and he had a great sense of humor. We were always laughing. I remember that, always laughing. In fact, to this day, that's my memory of Ron Richards, laughing. And any problem, you could go in and see Ron at some point in time. He'd always see you, talk to you, and provide guidance, and just an all-around great guy that deserves almost as much credit as Forrest for what got done in that 4-year period.
I agree.
Yeah.
No, there's no question. He was. My hindsight was this guy was like the Cardinal Richelieu of Montana. He had done so much and knew so many people, had been involved in so many campaigns, had already orchestrated so many amazing successes that we were learning at the foot of the master there, really. He was amazing. And he had no tolerance for sloppy work, but he wouldn't castigate you on it. And pretty soon, after about the third time that you would bring something to him, and he'd say, "Is this your best work?" that you made damn sure it was.
Yeah.
Because you didn't want to be embarrassed that it wasn't anymore. Because he was very conscientious about what came out of that office, very conscientious. But not rigid, not that, it wasn't a rigidity, it was a standard of excellence that he insisted upon. And I'm sure that's why Forrest felt comfortable just letting him run things from
He
day
did
to
let
day
him
to
run.
day.
You know,
did,
the
absolutely.
combination of those, maybe it was a unique combination.
Between Forrest and Ron?
Right.
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Oh,
I
yeah,
don't
definitely.
think there's any doubt about that.
No doubt about
Yeah,
it.
it worked.
Yeah, Ron knew when he had to get a hold of Forrest, and he didn't bother him if he didn't need to. And,
Right.
And I know Forrest had the absolute confidence in Ron, and knew that Ron knew politics enough to keep him out of trouble. And yeah, it was a great combination.
And get things done. I
Get
mean, that's
things done,
as we all learned
Yeah.
through
That's
the
it.
heats of fire, it's staying out of trouble and getting things
Yeah.
done.
Move the ball
Yeah.
forward.
It's a tricky
Move the ball
combination.
forward. And
Yeah.
you're right about that. You know, I always said the easiest way to have everybody love you is don't do anything.
Never say no.
You know.
Yeah.
Actually, Evan, that just reminds me, you taught me early on, very early on in this. I've learned a lot from all of you. But you said, you had a phrase that you used often. You say, you know, a lot can get done if you don't care who gets the credit.
Yeah.
And that was a spirit that really existed inside that office. I mean, people covered each other and helped each other, and I could go to any of these guys and, what the hell should I do with this? You know? And I was brand new. I didn't know anything about anything once I got inside there. I had a new suit, new briefcase, new fountain pen, ready to go.
Well, you know, partisanship,
No.
Didn't
which
exist.
is,
Well,
I
it
mean,
existed.
there was partisanship. We used to fight over things,
Yeah.
but there was a difference between then and now. And I want to have us address that a
my.
little bit, because
Oh,
you're
my.
bringing the perspective of still being active today and knowledgeable of what's going on today, yet being at those formative
No
stages
comparison.
back then when things were getting done and they required you to work across the aisle. They required the word compromise.
Yeah, and working in the '69 session of the legislature, I saw very clearly in that process how important it was to find a place to compromise and for both parties to work together. And I saw a lot of cordiality amongst the members. The Republicans and the Democrats were respectful of one another. They were respectful to agree to disagree. And then is there some place here that we can agree on? We might not agree out here, but maybe we're going to agree here in the middle somewhere. and it got a lot of things accomplished through the legislative system. Deinstitutionalization, one of the main people behind that was Republican legislator Gary Marbett, the elder, I'd have to say, because there was another younger Gary Marbett out there. But he was one of the chief people that was an ally to those folks that were trying to get the money moved from the state institutions out into the communities. And ironically, or however you want to look at it, coincidentally, I ended up the last 15 years of my career working in a program that was funded through deinstitutionalization money. And you know, I'm so glad that those people are no longer in institutions.
And so
they
glad
didn't
that
need
the people,
to be in institutions
and so glad that the people were willing to work to compromise to bring that
to
about.
make that happen.
You know, you had that same compromise you talked about with the water law, but it applied through many,
across
many
the board,
things.
yeah.
Think of your awareness and knowledge of senators at the time that, you know, they fought on the floor, but
Yeah, they worked together, but they also played together. I mean, they would go out and have a drink together, and I mean, they were a lot of them were from rural districts. They understood each other. They understood each other's problems, and they'd been there long enough in government to understand how things worked and what you needed to do to get it done. And I think that part is gone today. And these guys were well-read, intelligent people who understood Montana's problems real well and understood what needed to be done to get them fixed. And they would work together, not always everybody wasn't on the same page, but if you look at, we just talked about the water law, but there's a Utility Facility Siting Act, there was a whole bunch of legislation that came out of the Montana legislature and the governor's office that made Montana one of the leading states in the country in terms of the most forward-thinking constitution or forward-looking constitution, the environmental laws, everything else, and the administration structure, organization of government. All that took place because there was bipartisanship and a willingness on the part of both Republicans and Democrats to solve problems and work together.
I don't want people to look at us and think, well, there's a bunch of old guys looking back with nostalgia saying, boy, wasn't it great in the old days? But the truth is there is a really strong difference between the way government is approached today than it was approached back in that times in terms of compromise. When I was on one of our programs with Jim Lucas, who was the king of the sales tax, the biggest divisive issue of the time, he said, we recognized that we'd reached an impasse and we had to find a compromise. And we
had to
did.
resolve it.
And they found a way
As
through
opposed
it.
to closing down the government.
And as opposed to today, what are you saying? Today if it's going to burn the government down, so be it, huh?
Who cares?
Yeah, see, that was just none of that. Gary's right. These people were well-read. They knew Montana history. They'd lived a lot of it themselves and their families. They knew U.S. history. They knew how we had gotten to that point, and they knew that big deals only get done in the middle.
Let me
And these
raise
were all
the
big,
issue.
complex deals. Everyone that we dealt with
Since
was a
they
big,
all got
complex issue.
along together and maybe had a drink or played some poker, we did have a few poker clubs. still in
Smoked some
those days.
cigars. Yeah.
Let me pose the question of the words term limits. Has that served Montana well?
Mixed bag.
I think it depends on who we're talking about. There's some current legislators that I think term limits should have been 2 years. And I hate to name one as you and I think could agree on at least one of them. But I think in general it took away that continuity and understanding of problems that all these guys shared. Some of them, I think Francis Bardno was there for 25 or 30 years. I mean, these guys that understood not just the general idea of what government was. Francis Bardno knew what was in your budget down to the last typewriter. And so these guys were very good about understanding, knowing the problems, and working together to solve them. I mean, like on the water law, I mean, Bill Groff was from the Bitterroot, which is one of the most complicated, water use areas of the state. And Bill could stand up in the Senate and talk about the water law and what was needed. And the other people, Democrats, Republicans, gave him the respect of that knowledge and would listen to him and pay attention to what he was saying, because of that background and that friendship and that long-term getting together and solving problems. I mean, it was a different era. I don't think we'll ever see it again. I don't think we'll ever see it again.
We lost the historical wisdom is what we lost.
Yeah.
Well, that's
Determined.
like anything. Everything's a double-edged sword.
That's exactly right.
There's some good and there's some bad.
Yeah.
And the balancing act, the question is,
Good or
did
bad.
we, by losing the institutional wisdom,
Yeah.
was that worth it to throw some bums out?
We threw some very good people out with the bums, and those very good people are what made government better work.
Mike, you had some reflections about the fact that at that time, the folks, and as we entered government, we were not a product of the Depression, but our parents were, and the people who were the senior members of the government at the time were the products of the Depression and had a perspective about government that activist government.
Very, very much so. I mean, most of the people, other than our generation that was in there, so a lot of the legislators and most of the citizens of the state had direct experience in that time. And they saw government not as something to be avoided, not as an enemy, but as a vital piece of the society. It had helped them survive a desperate time. And they were committed to helping make that work for others. Now you just don't even hear that discussion anymore. But they would talk about what is best, and then that automatically included government, not just business or not just the environment or not just one thing or other. It was part of a whole, and they articulated that very thoroughly. And you don't hear it discussed at all now.
They saw government as necessary, not necessarily good, but necessary.
Necessary.
And they were willing to try and make it as workable as you could make it within that framework.
It's a vital part of the
That's
society.
exactly right.
Well, colored additionally with the fact that we, uniquely in Montana, were a one-company state
Oh, yeah,
for
that's
75
absolute-
years.
A
yeah.
long
Yeah.
time.
I mean,
Yeah.
this copper collar sounds like a colorful phrase, but that was pretty darn real.
Yeah.
And again, the premise of this whole series is that emerging from being a corporate colony to becoming a real state with empowered citizenry. Part of that, of course, was a new constitution, which Forrest also helped shepherd, although very quietly, because he understood that if he became overt, it
Right.
might get in the way.
Right. He may harm it more than
You
help it,
first
but-
wanted to go to work for the Con planning staff
Yeah,
efforts, but
see-
you got lucky. You got to go
Yeah,
into the
a week later I'm
executive branch.
hired by the governor, and I'm in the governor's office. I have a ringside seat for all of this and a way to participate. It was a blessing, Devin. It was like Gary and Frank have both said, there's no question that was the most formulative part of my life from there on in terms of work and how to judge people, what organization design, leadership, what does all that mean? We learned at the feet of the masters there, literally.
Now, I want to raise one more question here about young people getting into it, and just very quickly, that it was more than just in the governor's office, that
Yeah.
suddenly the doors were open in
Oh,
the
yes.
departments.
Yeah, throughout
That's
state
exactly
government.
right.
And we're benefiting from that to this day, I think.
It was statewide even, it wasn't even, I mean, young people joining nonprofits, young people signing up for environmental organizations, young people signing up for humanitarian things. It was pervasive, not just, but government was probably the largest beneficiary of that at the time.
A lot of the laws that were passed and you know, obviously had the state doing things it never did before, and you needed people to do it. And we were lucky, fortunate enough that we had a lot of talented people that came mostly out of Montana universities to draw on and bring into state government, and I think started a lot of them on careers that I presume they think were as useful as we think ours was.
I think I would offer that the enthusiasm to be in and involved and participate in government then was like to become a tech entrepreneur now. Mm-hmm. That's what people our age, that's mostly where they wanted to be. And I suppose that was coming out of the John Bob Kennedy era, you know, and everything that
Well,
happened
one of the
then.
challenges of today for young people is they've been raised on a diet of post-Reagan governmental negativity. That government is not, what do you say, government?
Government's the enemy in a lot of
Yeah,
ways.
it's not, government is the problem.
And so much
and-
of the manipulative Machiavellian politics that's happened has made government not able to work. So it's a self-fulfilling kind of wish by the people that are running that agenda. That government can't help and do as much as they could or should now as they could then and were expected to.
You know, it's interesting that we started out as, we call this New Kids on the Block, and by the way, when I say New Kids on the Block, I include me. And,
Yeah, you will.
because we
Yeah,
were
but you're
all
looking
there.
pretty old now. We all look great.
They're all young whippersnappers.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mike and I are still working. You know, I don't know.
yeah, we still show up.
But you know, it's the reflections of this period. It's important that these things be passed on. Part of what this series is about, and your presence at here today, is to be able to pass on to young people today that things weren't always exactly as they are today. Santa Ana said, you know, if you don't learn from history, you're condemned to repeat it. You know, there's been changes that have not been good. We have to rebound from that. We really need to hold up a mirror on ourselves in Montana, and this is kind of a period that, when we look in the mirror at ourselves, looks pretty good. Quick reflections. We're about to wrap up and come out of time. Your final thoughts on
Goes fast.
Forrest, the times?
I feel very lucky to have stumbled into the job that I did and be there at the time that I was there. It was just a wonderful combination of forces of change in society, a governor who wanted things done to improve the lives of the citizens of the state of Montana, an executive assistant who knew how to make those things happen, and a whole bunch of young people who were ready to make it happen and would put in the energy and the time to do it. And it was just a very fortuitous time.
Served Montana well. Gary?
So, you know, the neat thing would be if today we had Forrest and Ron sitting here.
Would that be great?
Sitting here listening to this. Yeah, it would be, because, you know, as you go through those periods in your life, you never have the reflection or the time or opportunity to tell those people what they meant to you in terms of your own career. And for me, that period was I just have a real great sense of pride of what we got done and everything that we were involved in that time period. And that includes going up through the judge administration and carrying on what Forrest did in that time period. I mean, it's just a great sense of pride of having the opportunity to participate and have the kind of history we're talking about today.
And have an impact like you have.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah.
No, I certainly agree with my colleagues here that it was a special time that we were very fortunate to have the opportunity to participate in, to learn and participate and take action in the way we were able to have the support from these incredible people that were really at the helm of this ship, and broad ability to go, do, fix it, make it work better, help people. It was, I've never experienced anything like it since, Evan. And I've been in this for 40 years. I've worked either with or for or around, close with 10 governors. No time like that one.
I think your reflections earlier, all of you, was that, and you particularly have had these multiple governors you worked for, that Forrest Anderson was unique, and the combination with Ron Richards was unique as well. I guess we were all blessed to have that opportunity, and that's why I wanted you to come on and share your thoughts on that in the Crucible of Change here. As I said, we were all new kids on the block. Now we're the old hands on the deck of the ship still.
Reflecting
and
back.
I hope we can pass through this program and the others some wisdom on to younger generations. So with that, we'll wrap it up. Look forward to seeing you on the next episode.